Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. What I decided to talk about this evening is Samatha meditation and Jhana. This is a very important topic for practice, and it's one that has a lot of confusion around it. Anybody who has listened to a lot of different teachers or read a lot of books on the topic of jhana in particular will probably come away confused, because there seems to be a wide range of interpretations and ways of talking about it. So before I go any further, I'll give a point of full disclosure and express my bias, the way I like to interpret the whole topic of jhana, which I'll tell you some will disagree with. I prefer to think of it, and I think it's more useful to think of the four jhanas as a continuum of continually deeper samadhi, rather than as sharply defined discrete states. And I think when you look at it that way, my feeling is that that clears up a lot of the confusion that you find in disagreements between different teachers, because I think that different people are interpreting different points along the continuum as being first jhana or second jhana, when it begins, and so on. The importance of jhana in the Buddhist system cannot be overstated, and this is also another point that I find misrepresented by a lot of moderns, is to downplay the importance of jhana, whereas in the Buddha's own teaching it was very central. The ultimate factor of the Eightfold Path is samadhi, right samadhi, and it's defined as first jhana, second jhana, third jhana, fourth jhana, right in the sutta. So jhana is part of the Eightfold Path, and it actually has a place of honor as the last factor in the path. Also, when you read suttas in English translation, and you see the word meditate, to meditate, or he meditates, it's most often translating the verb janeti, which means to do jhana. So for the Buddha, meditation is synonymous with jhana. Jhana is the Pali word. In Sanskrit is dhyana. In Chinese it became Chan, and in Japanese Zen. So the concept of jhana carries on through the history of Buddhism. The most important quality that is related to this kind of meditation and these mind states is samadhi. And this is another word that's problematic of translation. And it's something I've been saying now for some years, is that I really don't like the standard translation of many of the terms around meditation, and particularly samadhi, which has been translated for a long time as concentration. So you'll see the Eightfold Path, for example, the last factor given as right concentration. And I think this gives an entirely wrong feeling or tone to the idea. And I have seen it many times with meditators, that one of the big mistakes they make is pushing too hard with the mind. And I think in large part this comes from the language used to describe meditation. To talk about concentration or concentrating is really not at all what you should be trying to do. Samadhi is actually defined quite precisely in the old texts, in the commentaries in the Suddhimagga and in the Abhidhamma, as non-wavering, stability or stillness. Well, this is quite a different feel than concentration. The mind that has strong samadhi is still. It's quiet. It's not moving. It does have a single object. If it comes to the point of samadhi approaching jhana, it's unified on a single object. And this is another term, ekagata, which has been translated as one-pointedness, and I prefer to call it unification of mind, meaning that the mind is full of a single object. It's not flitting from object to object. So samadhi is a stillness, making the mind still. It's not a tiny, concentrated mind. Now this is where the mistake comes in. People think that they need to narrow the mind down onto the object. I've heard people use the metaphor of a laser beam, which I think is quite inappropriate. The mind with samadhi is vast and expansive. Remember that the jhana states are the equivalent of Brahma level consciousness. And the Brahma gods have vast, expansive range of consciousness. A Brahma god, the Mahabrahma, can contemplate 10,000 world systems, just as a man can hold sesame seeds in the palm of his hand. So this is not a concentrated mind. It's a vast, expansive mind, but it's still, it's stable. So this means when we're doing samatha meditation, which is meditation of unification, the meditation of stillness, the practice is to start with an arbitrarily chosen object. In our tradition, it's commonly the breath, but there's many other different objects that can be used. Sometimes in the Thai tradition, they use the mantra Buddho. Kasina can also be used, meaning a visual form. But the idea is to have an object that the mind can settle on and to allow that object to fill the mind. So rather than pushing the mind onto the object, the better way of thinking of it is to let the object fill the mind. The mind is still and receptive, open and expansive, but it's only paying attention, it's only allowing itself to be filled with the chosen object. And the skill in developing this deep samadhi is in one respect quite different than the skill needed for developing vipassana. In developing samadhi, the skill that needs to be worked on is the skill of non-attention, meaning that other objects which arise to the mind, as they inevitably will, passing thoughts, sensations in the body, sounds and smells, etc., from the external world, when these impinge on the mind, no attention is paid to them. So they're not encouraged, they're not cultivated. And this is another thing I found. A lot of Westerners particularly have, in their meditative careers, let's say, they've begun in a way that's backward from the Buddhist tradition. Many people, including myself actually, started with Vipassana meditation first, which is entirely backward from the way the Buddha taught, or as the ancient tradition has always been, that you develop Samatha first. So if you've been doing Vipassana for a long time and you try to do Samatha, you may encounter the difficulty of the mind turning to the passing objects. And it's like a new training. You have to learn this art of non-attention. So those are some general remarks on developing Samatha meditation, which is, as I said, the development of samadhi, principally, the most important quality. Now, in the descriptions in the suttas, we're given 4 jhanas, and they are defined by 5 factors, and there are 5 nivaranas, or hindrances, that are obstacles to samadhi. So there's these 2 opposing lists of 5, which are central to the theory and practice of developing samadhi. And the whole progress from the ordinary mind through the 4 jhanas is a process of simplification and purification. And this is another important point to grasp, that we're not gaining anything, we're not adding anything. You know, people can think wrongly that jhana is some exalted state that's extra to the ordinary mind, whereas it's a more useful and, I think, more true way of thinking that the deeper states of samadhi are the natural states of the mind when they're not corrupted by the defilements. And when the 5 nivaranas are not present, the mind will naturally sink into deeper samadhi. So the first thing to understand are the nivaranas. The word nivarana has a root meaning to wander wrongly, to go on a bypath, to get lost. So they're not really to be thought of as obstacles or blocks, but as side tracks, that you go wandering down the side track and get lost. And the 5 nivaranas are sensual desire, ill will, sloth and torpor, restlessness, and, or actually it's uddhacca kukucca, it's dual, it's restlessness and anxiety, and the final one is skeptical doubt or uncertainty. Sensual desire is a distraction from samadhi, because the mind, when it has entered jhana, has transcended the plane of sensuality. That the mind in first jhana is no longer in the kama bhumi, it's in the rupa bhumi. Of the 4 levels of consciousness recognized by Abhidhamma, the ordinary default consciousness for human beings is kama bhumi, or the plane of sensuality. That's our ordinary mind. And by sensuality here, we don't just mean the obvious extreme sensual desires like food and sex and so on, but just relating to the world through the senses is kama. Being distracted by the senses. The deeper one goes into the jhanas, the less the senses impinge on consciousness. And this is paralleled by the state of mind of Brahmas, who are on a level of consciousness beyond sensuality. Sensuality doesn't impinge on their consciousness. So if you're developing samadhi and you find the mind going to thoughts relating to the sense objects, even quite harmless, mild forms, that's still locking you into this lower level of consciousness, to the kama bhumi. Ill will, vyapada, is a broad term that covers all the ranges of negative emotions. And its obvious forms are like anger or hatred, but even irritation is vyapada. So this, in meditation, if you find yourself being irritated because the body's uncomfortable, or there's a fly buzzing, or it's too cold, or it's too hot, you're still locked into that lower level of consciousness. You're not escaping. You're not allowing yourself to transcend. You're falling into vyapada, which in many cases is just a negative form of sensuality, rather than attachment to pleasures and aversion to pain. One of the common problems beginning meditators, and even well on into the practice, can experience is pains in the body. And there are things you can do with stretching and yoga and good posture to minimize pains in the body, and that's all worth doing. But the meditator really only gets past pains in the body as a problem, not when they cease, but when the meditator ceases to let them be a problem. It ceases to be concerned about it. Sloth and torpor, tinamida, is dullness or laziness of mind and body, sleepiness or dullness, which obviously is an obstacle to samadhi. Samadhi is a wide awake state. If you feel groggy and dull, then you're not able to deepen the samadhi. And you should notice your state of mind, for example, when you finish a meditation at the end of the hour and you open your eyes. If you're feeling groggy and dull and confused, then you haven't been meditating properly. It should energize you and make you more wakeful. You should feel peaceful, but not dull. Uducha kakucha, which some translators have translated as worry and flurry, which is clever to try and mimic the rhyming sound in the Pali, is agitation of the mind generally, restlessness, the inability of the mind to be still. Uducha is restlessness. It's the factor of the mind that doesn't allow the mind to be restful. And kukucha is anxiety or worry, which is kind of an issue with the thinking process, running around in circles and being concerned about this and that. And obviously these are obstacles to samadhi. As a general point of practice, you never overcome restlessness by giving into it. If you're serious about meditation and you start to feel restless, then you just redouble your efforts to sit still. People think, well, I'm restless, I can't settle, I'll go for a long walk and then maybe I'll be able to meditate properly. No, that doesn't work. You're just feeding the demon. You're just encouraging the restlessness. The only way to overcome restlessness is with quietude. And the last one is translated as either skeptical doubt or uncertainty. Vicikiccha is the inability of the mind to just be restful with the practice, just to be devoted to the practice. And it takes many forms. In meditation, a common form is to be fretting in the mind about whether I'm doing it right. Is this the right way to do it? Rather than to just do it. If you just devote yourself to doing it, it sorts itself out with time. So these 5 hindrances or nivaranas are what prevents one from deepening samadhi and entering jhana. And as long as these are present in the mind, it's impossible to enter jhana. When they are suppressed or made quiescent, then the mind will naturally deepen the samadhi without further effort. It's just a natural settling of the mind. So once the nivaranas are made quiescent, the mind is not wandering down these side routes, then the first milestone is the first jhana, which is marked by 5 factors. This is how the jhanas are defined. And you'll notice as I go through them that we're starting with the most complex as 5 factors, and factors are lost as we advance. So this is my point of purification and simplification. Nothing is being added to the mind. We start with the mind confused by the hindrances. When the hindrances are absent, then the mind is in a simpler, more purified state. There's nothing added to the mind here. And 5 factors are present as defining qualities. The first 2 are vitakka and vichara, related factors. And these have been translated in various ways. Applied and sustained thought is a common translation. They're factors relating to the thinking process. Outside the context of meditation, they are the energies of the mind that produce rational thought and speech. But in meditation, we're using them to direct the mind to the object. And the balancing of vitakka and vichara in the early stages is very important as a exercise for deepening the samadhi. There are 2 different ways of taking the object. Vitakka is striking the object, and vichara is holding the object. So there are a number of similes given in the Visuddhimagga to express vitakka vichara. One that I think is very clear in its import is the striking of a gong. If you're trying to maintain a steady tone with a gong, then you strike it once and the tone will hold for a while, and as it fades you strike it again. If you keep striking it continually, you just have a kind of a unpleasant sound. And if you don't strike it enough, it'll just go silent, there'll be nothing. So vitakka is to be used more sparingly. Vichara is really the higher quality. When you first initially put your mind on the breath, that's vitakka, putting your mind on the breath. So there's a degree of forcefulness there. But then you hold the mind, hold the breath with the mind. You're not being forceful, you're not striking, you're just holding it. This has also been compared to holding a raw egg in your hand. If you hold it too tightly, you'll break the egg. If you hold it too loosely, it'll fall on the floor. You have to just have a steady, gentle holding. So vitakka and vichara are how the mind takes the object in these two different modes. Then the next two factors are also related, piti and sukha. And these also have been translated various ways. A common one is to translate them as joy or rapture for piti and bliss for sukha. And these are two forms of elevated state of mind that is pleasant. And the Buddha called jhana pleasant abiding here and now, blameless pleasure divorced from the senses. So it's an internally generated pleasure. It's a feeling of well-being. Piti is the lower form, and it has many different variations to it. And it's translated as rapture because it does have a bodily component or complement. It's actually a mental factor, but it does have a correlation with bodily sensations. And there are many different ways this can manifest, but common ones are like spine rushes or tingling or goosebumps. The highest form is said to be a feeling of levitation. It's not actual levitation, but a feeling, a subjective feeling of being very light and floating. This is called the uplifting piti. Sukha doesn't have these bodily correlates. It's translated as bliss, and it's like an oceanic bliss, a steady, calm feeling of happiness. It doesn't have any physical manifestation except the feeling of well-being in the body and absence of any pain or stress in the body. And the final fifth factor is ekaggata. And this has traditionally been translated as one-pointedness, which again, I'm critical of that translation because it has this implication of narrowing the mind. Pali words are often compounds, such as this one, and the compounds are sometimes ambiguous in that they can be grammatically broken down in different ways. And one way of breaking down ekaggata is a literal translation would be one-pointed, but it could also be translated as having gone to oneness. That would also be defensible grammatically, and I think it expresses the meaning better. The mind has become unified. It's unitary. It's not divided against itself. It's not taking on this or that. It has a single object. But it's not narrow to a point. It's still a vast, expansive mind. So those five factors are present in first jhana, and the movement through the jhanas is always a movement from the coarse to the subtle. And these are relative terms. So what seems subtle at one stage becomes perceived as coarse in the subsequent stage. So in the ordinary mind, the default mind of human consciousness, there's a range of feeling and relation to the senses, and some sensuality can be very coarse and some can be more subtle. Think of different kinds of music. Some music is very primitive and rhythmic and appeals to a lower kind of level of consciousness, and some is more elegant and refined. You know, some of classical music, you know, but it's still all sensuality, but there's a range of subtlety. But then when we cross over into the plane of form, that is entering into jhana, then all sense experience is perceived by the mind as coarse and undesirable, as heavy and gross. And the mind has transcended that. Now the coarsest factor that remains in the mind is vitakka vichara. And gradually that begins to seem coarse. And in second jhana, these factors are absent. And vitakka and vichara, as I said, relate also to the thinking process. So there is some thought formation still occurring in first jhana. But in second jhana, there's not, because the factor of vitakka and the factor of vichara have been transcended. And it's a natural progression, because the mind just begins to feel that thought is heavy and coarse and becomes more subtle. It drops away. These factors drop away. So one of our teachers, one of his quips was that if you find yourself wondering, am I in second jhana? The answer is no. So second jhana, the primary factor, the factor that dominates, now there's only those three factors, piti, sukha, and ekaggata, but the factor that's dominant here is piti. This is the jhana where piti is strongest. But that begins to seem coarse, this kind of thrilling, ecstatic sort of joy. The mind craves and moves to a more peaceful state of mind. And third jhana is marked only by bliss and ekaggata. So this is a peaceful oceanic bliss without any thrilling aspect. But even bliss begins to seem coarse, believe it or not, and the mind moves to an even higher plane in fourth jhana, which is marked by upekkha, equanimity, which is a more subtle state than bliss, and ekaggata, and just those two factors. So the whole movement through the jhanas is a dropping away of coarse factors and a strengthening or emphasis of the more subtle factors. And the mind is moving from a more complex state, a more variegated, differentiated state, to a more unified, simple, clear, pristine state of mind. And it's actually, in a sense, a more primordial state of mind. It's a more natural state of mind. If we take the cosmological or mythological origin story of humanity, we are Abhisara Brahma beings who became entangled with matter. The Abhisara Brahma beings live and dwell in the second level of the Brahma worlds in the equivalency of second jhana. So I think a deep meaning of this myth is that the Brahma mind is natural to us, and in a sense, when we enter jhana, we're remembering. We're going back to a more natural, primordial state of mind before we became entangled in the complexities of the sense world. There are many benefits for dwelling in jhana. As the Buddha said in the first place, it's a pleasant abiding here and now. but it's also the best preliminary state for attaining full awakening. That the mind is most conducive to penetrating insight immediately after emerging from jhana. One cannot practice insight within jhana, but immediately after emerging from jhana is said to be the maximum opportunity for realizing wisdom and penetrating the nature of phenomena and realizing nibbana. It's also just the practice of jhana or samadhi in general is very beneficial for the psyche, for the spirit. It's very healing, it's very centering, and very conducive to mental health. Often people ask me, what should I do for a daily practice? And, there isn't one size fits all. There isn't one good answer to that. But I think in general, if people have a busy life with a lot of duties and responsibilities and things going on, and they have limited time to meditate, they'll get the most benefit from doing samatha meditation rather than vipassana. Because what is mostly needed by people in the world, if they have a complex life, is some stillness and quietude. They need to find that still, calm center so they can then go back into activity with this inner stillness and strength. And if the mind is agitated and busy, just doing an hour of vipassana, unless you're very, very skilled at it, is not going to get you very far. You're not going to accomplish very much in a single short sitting. But you can make some gains with samatha meditation just in finding that inner calm and peace and that sense of well-being. And just generally that will improve your day. So that's some comments on samadhi and jhana.